Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Gregg Barak, who has a rather substantial body of work that studies crime and justice. Today we'll be discussing his very provocative and broad-based project entitled Crime, Equality, and Justice on Class, Race, and Gender. Welcome to Rip Rap, Gregg.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
This is really a huge, provocative kind of work that I was really enjoying reading, and also I should say it's a pleasure to have you finally on this program because we've been discussing the arrangements back and forth. What a pleasure to finally have you on the program and discuss your fascinating scholarship. You really have some groundbreaking work here in talking about the social realities of justice in America. What motivated you to look at a social constructionist approach to the study of criminal justice and defining crime and criminals as a product of moral agents, social movements, political interests, media dissemination, and policymakers? That's a big chunk of...
That's a lot of ideas that you're asking me to talk about. But first, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I give you a direct answer to the question how I and my co-authors, Gene Flavin and Paul Layton, came to a social constructionist approach to crime and justice, there's a book called Theorizing Criminal Justice, where Peter Kraska argues that there are 8 essential orientations or frameworks that help us to make sense out of the administration of criminal justice. One of those frameworks or perspectives is the social construction of reality. There are other framework or perspectives. One's a postmodern perspective, one's a bureaucratic perspective, a social industrial complex perspective. The most common is the legal rational perspective. We selected the social constructionist perspective because it's one that lends itself to incorporating all of those perspectives or points of view. As for me personally, I've been a social constructionist when it comes to the study of criminal justice from my very early roots, both as a student coming of age during the 60s in Berkeley and in my disciplinary studies that took me into anthropology, psychology, and sociology. So although I'm a criminologist, I am really an interdisciplinary social and behavioral scientist. Issues of class, race, and gender and were very heightened during the 60s, whether you were talking about the war and the draft and class, whether you were talking about women's rights and consciousness, whether you were talking about the third world or people of color movements. All of these voices which were coming onto the scene were expressing different takes or points of view. Fast forwarding a couple of decades, almost 3 decades later, there was the O.J. Simpson, Nicole Brown scenario, trial of the century. During that time, I was doing radio coverage here in Ann Arbor for the 9 months. And it became clear to me as I would talk with people after the shows that their gender, their ethnicity, their class shaded the way they looked at the administration of criminal justice. But at the same time, it works in the other direction, and that is to say that how we look at crime, how we look at justice, how we look at criminals is also shaped both in the law and in the society itself by the fundamental things that each of us brings to the table in terms of our multiple identities as male, as black or white, and it's a member of a social class.
Well, what fascinated me right from the beginning is that and you talk about not having a narrow approach.
Well, there's a legal definition of crime, and that simply says whatever the law prohibits or whatever the law prescribes. To deviate from either of those is to legally be liable for a crime. That's a very limited way of thinking about crime. We could also think about crime as that which harms or injures people, animals, the environment, whether or not there have actually been laws prohibiting those injuries or those harms. We could talk about analogous harm and analogous injury, and we could recognize many acts that take more lives, cost society more in terms of dollars, and yet are beyond incrimination for no other reason than the powers that be are not going to criminalize themselves if they can help it.
And you keep raising these issues about who's setting up the rules, who's administering the rules, who's being identified as the people who are violating the rules. And there's some really sharp comments that you have about what's happened in the history of this country about that. You know, that it's often the underprivileged, the disadvantaged, the marginalized who make a convenient scapegoat or something in this process in terms of power, you know, that they're going through.
This is true. There's always been what we in the business refer to as selective enforcement, differential application, but that speaks again to things that have been identified legally as a crime, but it doesn't speak to those things which, for one reason or another, either have not been criminalized in the first place, they have been maybe subject to torts, to civil violations, but not necessarily to loss of liberty or life. And so, to a large extent, the criminal justice system administers the crimes of the powerless, whereas the crimes of the powerful maybe are administered by the SEC or by the OSHA administration. Administrative law, not necessarily criminal law, but that's doesn't have to be that way. It could be otherwise.
Well, and you also talk about the three revolutions, you know, the study of criminology: reason, science, and reflexivity. Maybe talk a little bit, because we're still setting up this context.
Okay, well, this notion of three revolutions in the discipline of criminology spans several centuries, and we're talking more fundamentally about how humankind has explained to itself those people who do not conform, who deviate, who transgress, who become antisocial. If you go back to the Middle Ages, the so-called Dark Ages, you're in a very metaphysical period. Crime is about demonology, possession. The devil made me do it. Come forward a couple hundred years and you move into the age of reason, the age of enlightenment, and we now begin to think about crime as a rational choice. One has free volition. One weighs the consequences of his or her actions. So it's a question of weighing the pain of punishment versus the pleasure of crime or thievery. So there's sort of a rational calculus. And crime and punishment are seen as choices that people make, not things that are beyond their control or that they are possessed to do. Come forward another 150 years and we move into the age of medicine and science and Darwin. Then crime sort of switches gears, moves into a sort of a positivist mode rather than a classical mode of thinking, and crime is now determined rather than a matter of free will or volition. So there are external and internal causes, biological, psychological, environmental, that make people do things. So crime is something that is produced. It's not born, although there were some people who maybe argued that criminals were atavistic throwbacks, or that there's something in one's genes, but there's nothing there, as we know. And last but not least, as we sort of come to a peak in modernism, and as we move into sort of the deconstructionist, postmodern era, and where we are sort of somewhat disillusioned and cynical about the socially engineered society through science and solving all of the problems better through chemistry, people began to sort of stand back, reflect, and to recognize sort of dialectically that, you know, criminals are both determining and determined. It's not a matter of either or. And so it's a more complex way of looking at the etiology of crime today.
Yeah, there's this thread through the book about who is the criminal and under what circumstances that he or she or they become identified as criminals. And that's where we can really kind of shift into things like, you talk about ethnocentric beliefs, and then you start talking about specific groups, you know, or specific strata or specific categories like class or race, and how it's a matter of insider, outsider groups and the social relationships that they have. This is where I started really finding this fascinating, because it opened up my whole thinking about crime. And, you know, it's more than just, you know, a traffic ticket or some, you know, a murder or something like that. What's the process going on here?
There's multiple processes that are going on. If you ask the average person to explain crime, typically he or she will respond, oh, it's about deprivation, or maybe it's about being depraved. Sort of depraved or deprived is what one will generally tell you. One will associate crime with poverty, impoverishment, lack of education. One will also associate it with those groups who are impoverished, who lack education. So if you are both poor and of color, there is an association. There's also a prevalence, a higher rate of certain crimes by the poor, just as there are crimes by the rich that the poor would never engage in, i.e., poor people don't price fix, rich people don't hold up 7-Elevens, and those who price fix can write off their fines as a tax deduction and will not find themselves behind bars, whereas those who steal spare change, well, for the third time, will find themselves behind bars forever. But it's sort of a conception of those who are closer to us are less likely to be viewed as criminals wherever we are in the socioeconomic, in the multi-ethnic scheme of things. Those who are closer to us look more trustworthy and are thought to be less criminal-like. Those people who we defer to, who we admire, those people who have, quote, made it in America, it's hard to envision those CEOs of America and those accountants and those attorneys as being the crooks that they are. These are things that we are ready to make excuses for. It's a bad apple. It's really not what's going on.
Well, as I'm sitting there I was just thinking of the man from Brazil that was shot in London because the London police thought that he was a suicide bomber, you know, after these bombs that went off. And turns out he had nothing to do with it. But it's an instance where, based on race or based on certain physical characteristics, he was convicted and killed because he represented to what they thought was a threat.
On the face of it, one could argue that. The police would probably argue that there were a set of events and circumstances that led to his being killed. Had he, regardless of race or fitting a stereotype or a profile, had he not run, as they say that he did, although there's some conjecture as to whether or not he did in fact run, but he was face down on the ground when he was shot 5 times in the back of the head.
I thought that's kind of a case in point about how complex these things can become very quickly and right in everyday life.
The more common thing isn't really the racial profiling, it is more driving while black or driving while brown. When it comes to looking at a group of potential suspects where an actual crime has occurred and where descriptions have been given, that type of event is very episodic. But pulling over people who, as a group, drive slower than the white group that doesn't drive as slow, on the pretext that there may be other crimes involved with those individuals, even though they're obeying the speed limit and there are others who are not, is more in line with what you're talking about.
Well, and what's the basis? See, that's what I like about your book. You keep taking a look at what's the undergirding or the structural reasons. Why are people reacting this way? How do they come to construct their attitudes? Like the Middle Eastern people now, they're being stopped at airports. And they may not even be Middle Eastern. They just may have a physical characteristics that make them look like they came from Lebanon or Jordan or Syria or Iraq. I've talked to a number of people who say every time they go to the airport, they're getting stopped. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying that that society starts developing this racial profile, this certain collective characteristics of what's regarded as criminal, as suspect, as threat to society, to the people living in that area, and then start reacting on that basis.
It's not fully rational, but at the same time, you're going to look at who are the perpetrators of certain acts at a given point in time. There are millions of Middle Easterners. There is 0.001% of Middle Eastern terrorists out there. People are sort of knee-jerked. They'd rather be supposedly safe than sorry. They'd rather, in this case, rather than let several innocent people go, rather than convict one guilty person, there's sort of been a reversal where we'd like to minimize our mistakes and our collateral damage, but in the so-called bigger picture, there will be casualties.
In your book, too, you talk about this, and I've always wondered about, what is this war on crime?
We now have over 6 million people under some type of institutional or community supervision, where we lead the world in punishment any way you would like to measure it. And most of this growth has occurred when crime has been on a decade decline, both in terms of violent and impersonal. A lot of people say it's a function of the labor market, and that trends in punishment are more reflective of employment and unemployment, for example, than they are of the rise or decline in crime. Many people now argue that with a declining organized labor, that once again prison industries can compete. When labor was organized, prison industries were limited to certain activities. Now they are engaged in making blue jeans for Levi Strauss, in setting up reservations for United Airlines. So when you give your so when you give your credit card information, you're giving it to an inmate in Tempe, Arizona, in a correctional center. So to a large extent, you have a cheap source of surplus labor in those prisons. So you're regulating marginal groups. Related to that is the number of illegal aliens, illegal workers who are being pinched and incarcerated. There's a lot of money in the privatization and the construction of those facilities. I was going to give you a quick illustration of sort of the selective enforcement, the differential application. We hire tens of thousands, if not 100,000 illegal workers a year in this country. And tens of thousands are caught and brought back to south of the border each year. They're penalized. Every day we hear of these types of busts of workers. But over the last 6 years, we've gone from prosecuting employers who hire these people from very seldom to not at all. So, in other words, even though we have laws on the one hand criminalizing individuals to be employed here, those who are employing them, who are also violating laws, we're not punishing because there is money to be made. So they will recycle these Gusta arbiters, these guest workers. They will recycle them over and over and over, and there's money to be made in the recycling and the holding of those people. There's private contracts to provide them with food and clothing and a whole host of other things. And at the same time, the employers go on their way. If they're caught and they're busted, first fine is $225. Maximum fine is $3,000 after several times that they've been caught, and a fine up to 6 months in jail. So far, nobody's gone to jail.
And we haven't talked much about gender, and that's pretty, because I think that and victimology, as you talk in the book, opens up some discussion on violence.
That may not be as it appears, okay? For instance, despite the Columbine and despite a number of high school and middle-aged shootings, the actual patterns of assault and conflict and violence within the middle schools and high schools has actually been going down over the last 15 or 20 years. Also, one of the issues that people tend to focus on is interpersonal violence. Maybe, fights between individuals, domestic disputes. These things are also institutionalized. The division of labor, the gender divide and privileges at home, in the workplace, sexual harassment. These things are more than just individuals. They are pattern ways of interacting.
Well, there's certainly some profound dynamics going on. I mean, it can be very violent.
Drive-by shootings are maybe part of the scene, but I mean specifically, very few acts are random acts of violence. Okay, they may seem senseless, but they have purpose within a context. A stray bullet killing an innocent bystander happens on occasion, but that wasn't the motivation. That was a sort of a byproduct. The actual killing back and forth, these are issues over status, over honor, over territory, over trafficking in drugs.
Throughout the book, this is what fascinates me. It's more of this kind of like ecosystem kind of thinking. that you have a very dynamic living organism that we call society. And within that, you have all these tensions going on and these struggles and reactions and actions and reactions. And then within that, you have this part of the facet or the thing that we call crime or criminal or conflict, and the different strata or different populations within that, or the elements of class and race and economics. And you're trying to understand this in a dynamic sense, and that's what I'm saying. I think it is very important.
It has to do with we're a society of winners and losers, okay? We're a very adversarial society. We're not a mutualistic society. We're not a sharing society. We're a highly competitive society. So rather than look at the origins of these problems and rather than bring the community in, we bureaucratically process one criminal after the next and lock them up and throw away the key. But even though that's the approach that we have taken, there is good news, okay? There are two movements afoot that are interchangeable or overlapping. One is referred to as restorative justice, which is just not something going on here, but it's going on sort of worldwide, which is to move away from an adversarial approach, to bring the victim and the offender and the community together, to try and find resolutions that make the community and the perpetrator and the offender and the whole again. This is sort of a radical approach. There's also hundreds of experiments going on throughout the United States in what are called problem-solving courts. And what they're doing is they're specializing by problems. They have drug courts, they have domestic violence courts, they have gun courts, they have traffic courts, they have neglect courts, they have sexual offenders courts. They are less concerned with guilt and punishment and more with restitution, compensation, restoration. Hundreds of those examples going on today. So there is maybe a light at the end of the tunnel, and there are lots of people who have made the connections between neglect and abuse and impoverishment and the likelihood that those victims will become perpetrators. So, I mean, there is some understanding going on.
Well, I think your book really does a lot of work, and your project and your scholarship has done a lot in terms of looking at these, I guess, this place of intersection, of the intersecting of these different interests of society. And I found it a very interesting read, and I'm glad you were able to be on the program. So thank you for being on Rip Rap.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, Jim. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure, Jim.